There we go. So welcome everybody. If you have not been before, those are my details at the bottom of the screen. So you can use the Twitter handle or the hashtag in order to live tweet or comment on the class. Obviously as well, if you're in the Facebook group, for example, you're welcome to comment in there. Today's topic is heroines, wives and demons, Gothic women and women's Gothic. Now, if you have been to any of my previous classes, you know that I have quite a lot of problems with this designation of something called the female Gothic, or this idea of a sort of homogeneous or definable women's Gothic. So although that is the title, it's something that we're going to sort of dissect and interrogate a little bit today as well. So the three sections for today's class, the first of them, I'm going to be looking at the term for female Gothic and investigating sort of its uses, but also to what extent it can be said to be helpful as a paradigm through which to interrogate the Gothic. In the second section, I'm going to go back into my comfortable space of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We're going to be having a look at sort of the depiction of women and the work of women authors in that period. Now, it's not a complete overview of the period, but it will be doing a deep dive. And I'll chat a little bit more about my intentions with it after I've done the sort of legwork and the foundational work of the first bit. The third part today is going to be looking at the 20th century and various evolutions of women in the Gothic. So that's women as writers, as producers, and as protagonists of the Gothic. There's so much out there that, of course, I won't be able to give anything like a survey of what's going on. So what I've chosen to do instead is pick a particular text, in this case, Jane Eyre, and look at the way in which women's Gothic, or the women in the Gothic, have sort of evolved and moved on and diversified from that point, and looking at some of the different manifestations of the Gothic by women, using some sort of subheadings taken from our analysis of Jane Eyre. So that's the plan for today. Hopefully you'll be able to stay for all three parts. So without further ado, let's get into this question of the so-called female Gothic. Is there such a thing as the female Gothic? Now, just spoiler alert, no. For me, as you well know, I don't really find this a particularly helpful term, but what I'm wanting to do is engage with the way that perhaps you've encountered it and the sort of ideas and feelings that exist around this term female Gothic and how it's being applied or how it's being used at the moment. So obviously, the first thing that perhaps leaps to mind, and when I put this question up on Twitter, I only had two answers, but this was one of them, was sort of the Radcliffean Gothic, or this conception of a Radcliffean Gothic. So obviously, if you were here at last week's lecture, you'll be aware that Radcliffe herself wrote things a lot more diverse than what we consider to be the Radcliffean formula. But that particular idea of Radcliffe as a writer and that type of novel, using the heroine in peril and the supernatural explained, etc., is one of the sort of key images associated with the female Gothic. Now, if you're looking at the work of a critic like Anne Williams, for example, she ties that very strongly to what she considers to be the specifically female Gothic tradition, going through Jane Eyre and into the Romance Gothic, or the Gothic romance of the 20th century. But is this all there is? Is that what the women's Gothic was doing, this sort of continual narrative retracing its same steps? I mean, we're already sort of starting to discombobulate that a bit with a piece like Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which is engaging with a number of the same tropes and story points, but is obviously coming at it and presenting it from quite a different angle, with a much more skeptical view and relation to it, the depiction or understanding of domesticity and marriage as a resolution point of these narratives. Obviously, as we're going on as well into the 20th and 21st century, different versions of a female story, or different versions of a vast sort of array of different women are going to be appearing in films, and different narratives about women are going to be appearing in films and in literature. And we see that, for example, in a text or in a trope like The Final Girl, where you're moving away from some of these conceptions of the female that we're having in those early British Gothic texts. Now, in discussions of the female Gothic, we start off with quite a oh yes, I have quite a clear idea of what this is, but we can start to break that apart a little bit more. We've already broken it apart down a little bit by thinking about how it develops over time. The text that I'm obviously referencing here is Frankenstein, written by a female author, but of course not dealing with the story of any of these novels and not dealing with this conception of a heroine in peril. So Mary Shelley's work often forces us to confront the question of whether these texts that center male protagonists, do we exclude them from the female Gothic because of that? I mean, certainly not. The person who coined the term female Gothic was Ellen Moyers, and her sort of paradigmatic example was Frankenstein as what she considered a birth myth. And you can agree or disagree with that as you will. Another thing that we have to bear in mind or consider when thinking of the female Gothic is the depiction of female stories by male writers, such as Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, and also, perhaps more importantly, the rewriting of these stories by female writers and producers, as we see in the newer web series of Carmilla and the film of the same series. So some of the problems with this female Gothic definition and how we're often conceiving of it is we're producing a particular type of female subject or identifying a particular type of female subject often when we're discussing it. And that subject is white, often cishet, and we're looking at these texts as producing some sort of universal narrative about female experience. Now, there are a number of problematic elements to this, of course. It's very much, of course, buying into a universalizing binary between male and female and ignores any sort of consideration of different gender identities, but also universalizes those experiences and doesn't bear in mind intersectionality, basically, but factors such as class or race. So novels like Beloved by Toni Morrison, written by women about female experience, we need to sort of think about how they can be included and how they're understood as being part of the female Gothic. Similarly, texts like this one that's upcoming in August, let's say, and how they're engaging perhaps with writing for or about children or young adults. Often the narrative of the female Gothic, not always, but often centers a sort of cishet narrative. And so texts like Fingersmith, and a lesbian tradition perhaps in fiction are not necessarily as considered. So our understanding of the female Gothic needs to move beyond this assumption of a central relationship between male and female protagonists. As I already mentioned, this conception of the female Gothic is usually centered on a sort of white middle class subject, and we need to, obviously there's a question about what we do with texts by working class writers, talking about working class subjects. In the picture there you see The Moth by Catherine Cookson. And then of course there's the question raised by male authored texts which align themselves very clearly with other examples of the Gothic or the Gothic mode being employed by women. So texts like Crimson Peak quite clearly are identified with a very similar female Gothic narrative of the heroine in peril, for example, the treacherous domestic space, etc., but are also aligned with male writers, producers, and directors. So how do we assess the female Gothic when we've got all of these factors that we need to bear in mind and which are often excluded from this conception of a female Gothic, with its universalizing conception often of a female experience? Well, we've got some questions in mind, so let's have a look at how this has been understood over time and interrogate these sort of definitions. So in conceptions or depictions of the female Gothic, the presence of the female is often one of the most defining characteristics. And again, this is, sort of the, this is a binary conception both of gender and of literature, bizarrely. But one of the main sort of points of view is, of course, this idea of the female writer as being the definitionary point for the female Gothic. So Ellen Moyers, for example, coined the term and defines it thus, that it's to do with the work of women writers writing in the literary mode known as the Gothic. The main definition, women writers. There's an emphasis here on the literary mode, so already we're getting a slight discomfort because we're not addressing sort of other productions, including the filmic. And this idea of the Gothic, it all sounds so simple and easy to identify. Oh, it's just Gothic books written by women, easy. Apart from then, of course, you're moving into the, oh no, now we have to assess what the Gothic is kind of side of things. But there are also some ways in which we can already start to critique or look at this definition as not being quite so simple as it first appears. If it's producing this conception of a unified body of literature which forms its own tradition, there's the question of, I'll keep mentioning Mary Shelley today because she's a good outlining example. How do we deal with these female texts by authors like Mary Shelley, which focus almost exclusively on a male protagonist and sort of male experience, as it were, presented by a female author? How do they fit into the conception of the female Gothic? And how do texts which are very diverse or don't align in any way with the sort of the vague idea of a female Gothic plot, how do we integrate those into our discussion of the female Gothic? Are we producing a homogeneity by suggesting that all female authored texts are somehow part of the same tradition, somehow part of the same Gothic, distinct, apart, aside? There's also, of course, the question about male authors writing in the female Gothic mode, or the mode often identified as female. So Ethelwina of the House of Fitzalbin is by the male writer T.J. Horsley Curtis, and is quite clearly engaged with sort of the terror Gothic, as it were, the form that's most often sort of identified or allied with the women's Gothic. Similarly, how do we deal with the question of male authors using female pseudonyms? I put a tweet up about this on Twitter this week, and it turned out that it was quite a big bit of news to a lot of people, that sort of quite a large subsection of the Gothic romance in the 20th century was written by men who were writing under female pseudonyms. And I've given you 2 examples there, but there are many more. So how do we start to confront this idea of a female Gothic when we have male authors writing within that genre? Do we pretend that there is some ineffable distinction between their writing and the women who are writing the Gothic romance, for example? How do we start to assess that difference? So it's a bit of a problematic way. It doesn't quite hold up in terms of defining the female Gothic. So another way of offering a definition of the female Gothic that focuses on the presence of the female is offered by Margaret Carroll Davison in her book on Gothic literature, who notes that perhaps the most useful and uncontroversial, optimistic there, definition of this classification will be limited to its narrative focus, namely on a female as opposed to a male protagonist. Now, we've already talked, of course, about the problems caused by Mary Shelley, and she's here again. Does a story have to focus on a woman to be considered part of the female Gothic? And if so, why? So The Castles of Athen and Dunbayne uses a lot of the similar, by Anne Radcliffe, uses a lot of the similar tropes and narrative patterns as the rest of her work, but is focused on 2 male heroes, as is, for example, Gaston de Blondeville. So are we supposed to dismiss this work because of its lack of a female protagonist as part of the female Gothic? How does it all fit in? We're also confronted with how to deal with texts like Stephen King's Carrie, for example, or the film from 2015, Final Girl, which had basically an all-male cast of directors and writers, etc. How do we deal with these narratives? Are they part of the female Gothic because of their concentration or not? So we're getting already this sort of split between, we can't maintain at both points that it has to be female authored and it has to be based on a female protagonist, because it becomes very clouded and very, very difficult to assess. And already this idea of the female Gothic is becoming more and more dissolute, breaking up a little bit. One of the other ways of considering the presence of the female, of course, is that of the putatively female reader. So numerous critics have pointed to the idea of the female Gothic as a form written by and for women, including quite influential critics E.J. Clary and Anne Williams. Now, there is this sense in which the Gothic is allied or often marketed to, particularly different variants of it, to women. This does not and has never meant that there is a homogenous readership for these texts. and to sort of suggest that any particular genre is only accessible or readable to one binary gender is peculiar, I would argue, however it's marketed. Thinking about this historically, Edward Jacobs has done work on Anne Radcliffe and romantic print culture. And he notes that although all extant evidence indicates that far more men than women subscribe to circulating libraries, one of the main sort of methods of getting Gothic novels out there into the public, from the middle of the 18th century, circulating libraries gained a reputation for mainly renting fashionable novels to frivolous women. So we can see here a break between the reputation of these libraries and the novels that they're famous for producing or loaning out, and the reality of subscription data. And although, of course, you will have women using, for example, their husbands' or fathers' subscriptions, it does problematize this account of it being a women's genre, as do the many, many accounts from the period of men reading it. Famous authors, of course, have often mentioned either Radcliffe's work or its impact upon them, or the work of other Gothic authors of the time. So you've got Walter Scott, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, etc., sort of offering proof of a male readership, and not sort of insulated incidents either. You also have sort of fictional evidence for this engagement with a supposedly female Gothic from male readers. And I'm not saying in any way that having a male readership legitimizes a genre. What I'm trying to indicate is that that association of a genre with one particular gender is always going to be very problematic. So I don't know if any of you can recognize this quote or you know where it's from. Do put your guesses in the chat. The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. I have read all Mrs. Radcliffe's and most of them with great pleasure. The Mystery of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time. I can't imagine. My hair didn't go anywhere when I was reading Mysteries of Udolpho. Anyway, the big reveal. It's Mr. Tilney glaring at you for suggesting that only one gender can read Gothic novels. So if we're moving away from those kind of definitions of the presence of the female as being the definitionary factor, how are we understanding, or how is the female Gothic often being understood? Well, emphasis is often placed on aesthetics and form as one way of defining a genre, with the suggestion of a differentiation between the male and the female Gothic along the lines of the horror and the terror Gothic. Now, as you'll know, those are the terms that I prefer to use because they're based not on the gender of the author or the protagonist, but on the techniques and sort of aesthetics of the novel. But what is this differentiation? So terror and horror is obviously that those terms are taken, and the differentiation is taken from Anne Radcliffe's 1826 essay, on the sublime and the beautiful, on supernatural in poetry, which differentiates, as I've talked about many times, if you've not been before, if you've been before, terror is allied to a sense of obscurity, curiosity, and exploration. It opens the mind at the same time as terrifying you. Horror, on the other hand, confronts you with the already known, and presents you with the horrifying, which freezes the faculties. So, for example, the discovery of a dead body or a bleeding ghost. So there's this sort of sense that you can universally ally in the discourse of the female Gothic. There's a sense that you can universally ally male Gothic with horror and female Gothic with terror. But of course, again, very problematic. It doesn't bear in mind texts by female authors that are quite clearly within the horror train, such as The Libertines or Zafloya by Charlotte Dacre, or works like T.J. Horsley Curtis's, which are more involved with terror. It's also quite an old-fashioned way of looking at things, particularly if you're trying to include a 20th or 21st century understanding of the Gothic or this idea of the female Gothic, because of course women writing Gothic and horror in the 20th and 21st centuries are branching out very much into the portrayal of horror and the real supernatural. So again, this idea of the real supernatural being allied with a horror Gothic and with a male Gothic is increasingly problematic, particularly if we're thinking even about the 19th century and the proliferation of ghost stories by women. But even in that 18th century, this is really a sort of spurious divide to some extent. If you've been to my ghost lecture, you will have talked about the ways in which ghosts were understood and how that is represented in the text. And if you remember, we have those positive understandings of ghosts as well, under a providential order and offering no hurt or harm to the virtuous. So in a text like The Old English Baron by Clara Reeve, and I've used this picture here of Hamlet to offer a sort of an example. It's very similar story-wise to Clara Reeve, and this scene could easily be out of Clara Reeve here as the ghost points towards his own vengeance. But texts like that are producing these sort of positively understood ghosts, so they're still working very much within a terror rather than a horror framework. So that connection of the real supernatural exclusively with horror is faulty, and the connection of those two things with only male Gothic or male authored texts or texts focused on male protagonists is also faulty. There's also this distinction, perhaps again looking in terms of aesthetics, between visual and audio Gothic. So the suggestion is that terror Gothic and female Gothic relies more on audio clues because there's a much greater element of obscurity there, and the horror relies on a visual representation or confrontation with the horrific. And to some extent, those are useful ways of considering the difference between horror and terror. But as with all of these things that we're talking about, they certainly can't be understood as being divided entirely by gender. The other point that Edward Jacobs again brings up in terms of horror and terror, and even that distinction between them, which I often use, is that distinction itself, in terms of how it applies to literary texts considered as whole texts, is quite problematic. He notes that scholarly emphasis arguably distorts historical practice, since Lewis and most of the other male Gothic writers or horror Gothic writers also reproduced the terror Gothic conventions that Radcliffe's novels popularized. In other words, the techniques of the terror Gothic or of terror were part of the creation of tension and suspense in horror Gothic novels as well. And I think that Crimson Peak at the bottom there is quite a good example of the way in which terror techniques of suspense, curiosity, and terror become horror moments when confronted with the real. So another way of understanding the female Gothic, and if you know me at all, know anything about me, you're going to know I hate this one, is the idea that there is a female Gothic plot. So this has been very popular in terms of sort of that initial interaction with the idea of the female Gothic. And Anne Williams offers this sort of formula of the female Gothic, suggesting that there's a heroine who comes from her home of initiation, and the novel works towards her happily ever after. She'll have a responsibility within the text, often a child, but perhaps an elderly relative, for example. There will be a first suitor and often a second suitor, although there might not be the second suitor. And there will be a male and or female antagonist, and then there will also be a confidant. As you'll notice, of course, this plot summary is very much leaning towards a sort of heterosexual conception of the female Gothic here. It's also pointing to the female Gothic as a comic tradition, which, as we're going to see, can be, to some extent, problematic. So I've put text at the bottom there, and some of these appear to agree with this definition or understanding of the female Gothic, but there's always going to be problems with a plot-based definition like this. It becomes incredibly prescriptive, rigid, and reductive, narrowing down our understanding of what can belong to the female Gothic genre, and quite arbitrarily getting rid of other texts. So a novel like Zofloya, for example, which explores a monstrous female protagonist and her descent into vice and murder, an eventual fate of doom at the hands of a devil throwing her off a cliff, is excluded from this conception of the female Gothic because it's not focused on an appropriate narrative. The other problem with this idea of a plot-based system is that it very much distorts our understanding of the text themselves. So I'm going to illustrate that on the next slide in a second, but we can have a look at how it perhaps applies or how it gets challenged by the text below. So this particular narrative, of course, appears to fit really well with texts by Anne Radcliffe from that central period of her production, such as a Sicilian romance or a Romance of the Forest. It also can be mapped onto fairly different texts, but the proliferation of writers such as Regina Marie Roche and Charlotte Smith writing other texts which featured this sort of virtuous female heroine in peril. You've also got that move into the 20th century, and you can suggest that this model also fits onto the Jane Eyre framework. But of course, we're starting to see how this concentration is ignoring other underlying elements of the novel, subplots and considerations. And how, for example, in relation to Jane Eyre, it's quite clearly just glossing over the school as an irrelevant stepping stone to the rest of the narrative. And Bertha is nothing other than a simple female antagonist. Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca challenges it in the sort of the ending of the text, which, although apparently comic, does place a much more skeptical eye on that conception of a happy domestic end. And Victoria Holt is a useful writer in seemingly producing this narrative, but we find that if we apply it to our understanding and analysis of Victoria Holt's novels in the Gothic romance genre, what it completely excludes is her constant and sort of centralized emphasis on different relationships between women within her text, and usually a network of differing women, all in relationship to each other and not simply through the main protagonist of the text. But I've already said that even text to which this seems to apply, it does distort and narrow down our understanding of them, producing a fairly homogenous conception of what these stories are doing, and getting rid of all the subplots and perplexities, the other issues with which the novels are engaging. This is particularly clear, I think, with The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. So it seems to fit quite well into this pattern at first glance. We have the heroine, Emily St-Aubert, the home of initiation in La Vallée, and then this move towards a happily ever after, once again in La Vallée, through marriage and the inheritance of her own property. So there's this economic fairy tale as well going on. Her responsibility at the beginning of the book is arguably her sick father, but becomes Madame Montoni, although putting Madame Montoni into the responsibility category, which she is in the Castle of Udolpho, also sort of dismisses her role as an antagonist or as a persecutor. The suitor is Valancourt, and the second suitor is the Monsieur de Pont. Inexplicably, Emily, of course, chooses Valancourt, mystery of life. The male antagonist is arguably Montoni, although he only exists in approximately a third of the novel. The female antagonist arguably would be Madame Laurentini, and the confidant is Annette, although the way in which Laurentini figures as a female antagonist is not as a sort of rival or necessarily sort of in Emily's story, as a catalyst in Emily's story. She's connected to a different subplot and narrative that weaves in with Emily's story at the end. But this concentration on this conception of the Mysteries of Udolpho following this guideline or this plot really does distort and dismiss or erase a lot of what is going on in the novel in terms of its complexities and its various different interconnecting plots. So it ignores secondary female characters such as Blanche and their role in the story and their own sort of separate narratives. It also ignores the wider cast of male characters such as Count Morano, who is another suitor for Emily's hand, another man who is persecuting her at one point and also attempting to liberate her. And that sort of distinction between who is, particularly in terms of her relationship with Count Morano and Montoni at the time, the relationship between who is rescuer and who is persecutor is very blurred, as Montoni, who's persecuting her throughout the novel, protects her from the advances of Count Morano, who says that he's protecting her from Montoni's plans. There's also other characters like Cavigni, Verezzi, and Bertolini, who are, they interact with Emily in the text, but their story is predominantly distinct from hers and is a subplot about sort of political intrigues and resistance, which we're seeing in the text as well, and is often dismissed or erased by this concentration on a single plot. Also, this plot ignores the sort of the subplots of hauntings connected to the Chateau Leblanc. It's often sort of, in summaries, I often see a discourse which sort of ends the stories of Mysteries of Udolpho, ends the summary of the retelling after she escapes from Udolpho, but that's only like 2/3 of the way through the book. There's a lot to go after that. And so the hauntings themselves originally are connected to Emily, but eventually become investigated principally by the Count de Villefort and Ludovico, the hero servant that I've talked about before. So we're moving away again from Emily's narrative, and this distinct subplot gets erased if we only concentrate on this central narrative of Emily. Also, the bandit episode, which doesn't feature Emily at all, but only people coming to visit her. This concentration on the story also erases the role of poetry in the novel and its importance, particularly. For the reader, particularly today, it might be mostly irritating as it interrupts the narrative or the plot. But it's doing a lot of work, both for Radcliffe as an author and for Emily as a character. A lot of the poems, particularly in The Mysteries of Udolpho, are intriguing commentaries on the text and on its underlying themes. But the poetry also functions to make particular claims for both the author and the character in terms of equating them with female original genius as authors. So Radcliffe includes these poetic episodes, and they blur with the epigraphs themselves and the unattributed poetry to put both Radcliffe and her heroine, in terms of their creative output, in terms of the discourse being created by the text, puts them on a level with canonical writers which are being quoted. This emphasis on that central storyline, or on that particular version of the central storyline, also kind of moves away from the economic storyline, not only the tale of Emily's inheritance, but the anti-capitalist critique, which you quite clearly get in the novel, in terms of a particular view of mercantile society. And also moving away from the very complicated engagement that Radcliffe has with aesthetic discourse. It's also ignoring the importance and the role of secondary male figures, benevolent male figures such as St. Aubert and the Count de Villefort. Although the Count de Villefort is a really intriguing figure because he doesn't quite fit into either bracket, as you would know if you read the novel. So the plot isn't something that's really going to work for us. And this particular conception of a type of female Gothic, which you can understand as being a specific story being told and retold, is distinctly unhelpful in terms of getting rid of or ignoring important texts and women writers and female protagonists, female sort of texts which deliberately engage or market themselves towards a female readership. But of course, it obviously distorts our conceptions of the text themselves, even when it appears to apply. So one of the areas in which we can perhaps look more fruitfully at what the female Gothic might be doing is this idea of it creating or writing out female experience and subtext. So probably the writers or the critics that you'll be familiar with in discussing this are Gilbert and Guibard and their influential book, The Mad Woman in the Attic, which was published in 1979. Their argument is that there is one plot that seems to be concealed in most of the 19th century literature by women, which will concern us here in some sense of the story of the woman writer's quest for her own story. The story, in other words, of the woman's quest for self-definition. Whether this appears in the heroic figure, the heroine figure and her Bildungsroman, or in the sense of the monstrous feminine as part rejected dark double of both heroine and author. Those are the arguments that Gilbert and Guibard are putting forward. Of course, we can start to problematize this already, the sense that there is one story, the sense that there's a universal female experience, the fact that the suggestion that women are always writing female experience, and therefore women's literature is always this distinct creation apart from, rather than engaging on equal terms with, male authored literature, is to some extent problematic. We have to put this, of course, in the context, in this terms of what second wave feminism was doing in terms of trying to create a conception of a female authored canon. But as we're sort of moving on now, we don't need to be producing, to the same extent, we don't need to be producing the idea of the female authored canon to the same extent. So we need to be moving away, arguably, from these more reductive conceptions of what the female Gothic is or can be. Another sort of common conception of the female Gothic is that it is narrating patriarchal oppression. So Gilbert and Guibard point to the dramatizations of imprisonment and escape as being all pervasive and a uniquely female tradition in the period, which is, again, a little problematic. Certainly they're frequent figures of the Gothic, but even if we're looking at my period, so the early 19th century, imprisonment and escape are pretty much a feature of the Gothic, full stop. Texts like The Monk by Matthew Lewis and Maturin are dominated by depictions of confinement and escape by both male and female protagonists. So this conception that it's a uniquely female narrative is harder to justify. What Ellen Ledoux suggests is that this kind of concentration, of course, on imprisonment and escape is all part of the themes of the text, and this identification or focus on women's domestic incarceration, sexual violence, economic disenfranchisement, and spectral maternity. So as Ellen Ledoux herself points out, these themes are often central to a number of sort of women-authored or women-focused texts within the Gothic. But they're not all that there is. Not every text on women's Gothic is primarily focused on women's plight. And this can be, these kind of modes or issues can be addressed by all writers, of course, but although they appear frequently, we need to move away from a focus that this is what the Gothic inevitably does, what the female Gothic inevitably does, or female authored texts inevitably do. Because it's sort of limiting, very much limiting what the female Gothic can be. So this other idea that perhaps the female Gothic is offering a gender-inflected social commentary, again, Carol Margaret Davison suggests that it spoke back to the mainstream Gothic form from a specific gender-aware perspective. And to some extent, you can definitely see this in texts like, we've got The Demon of Venice there, but the picture, it's a sort of chapbook for Zafloya by Charlotte Dacker, which I've already mentioned, and is often considered to be a sort of female rewriting of the Ambrosio narrative that you have in The Monk by Matthew Lewis, but here we have a female protagonist. Similarly, in Wuthering Heights, you can view it as a rewriting or a reimagining of the Byronic figure, both the Byronic hero or anti-hero and Byronic heroine or anti-heroine. Then later texts such as The Seventh Bride, I've used that as just one example of the many sort of Gothic interactions with fairy tales that we have, takes the fairy tale narrative Bluebeard and rewrites it from a particular perspective, back from a arguably a female perspective. And of course, thinking about fairy tales, by the way, we're looking at a tradition which orally is often allied to female writers, but in terms of how those fairy tales entered the literary sphere, we're looking largely at male transcribers of stories. And it's those sort of versions of the fairy tale which have entered the popular consciousness with those morals particularly provided by male writers. So in the early editions of Bluebeard, for example, you see this narrative about, you know, female curiosity is what gets you in trouble to some extent. Whereas a novel like The Seventh Bride reimagines the sort of the moral framework of the story and puts much more of an emphasis on sort of female solidarity as the cure to the problem, rather than just not looking in the locked room. So there's definitely a certain extent to which this is a useful way of conceiving of how female authored texts sometimes engage with the Gothic. But of course, the idea that women writing the Gothic are always writing a distinct women's Gothic is to some extent problematic, because it places an emphasis on the gender of the author, which others them from the main literary field. We have the canon, and then we have what women are doing with it, rather than kind of producing this narrative of equal place and interaction between male and female writers in terms of their development of the genre, for example. Another common conception is that the female Gothic focuses on women's experience of love, domesticity, marriage, and property ownership, often from a quite negative perspective, of course. So Davison here is talking about Radcliffe, but suggesting that what was established was an enduring female Gothic recipe, explored the conjunction between love and terror, called women's domestic roles and ideals into question, and contested property-related issues. And to a certain extent, we certainly see that in a number of Gothic novels, particularly in that sort of late 18th and early 19th century period. But of course, as we're all aware, to suggest that women are inevitably writing about love, domesticity, marriage, and property ownership within that framework is reductive. I don't think I need to say any more about that. Another conception of the Gothic is often this emphasis on the mother, the absent mother or the evil mother. So Robert Miles suggests that the plot of the female Gothic is a heroine in search of an absent mother and in flight from a cruelly tormenting patriarchal father. And to some extent, it sometimes works. Sometimes it just doesn't. There isn't an absent mother, or there isn't a persecuting patriarchal figure, or particularly a persecuting father. Davison also points to this idea that of the fearing of the mother. So numerous analysts of the female Gothic have suggested that fear of the mother lurks at its core, either the fear of becoming the mother or the fear of the threat that's posed by her, particularly within the text. Now, again, this is useful in pointing us towards things that are often coming up in female authored text or female focused texts. But once again, of course, it's relatively reductive. And I think that until we start talking about male authored text as inevitably focusing on the absent father or the relationship with the father, we can back away from saying that that's what female texts are always doing. The last sort of category that I'm going to mention is this exploration of female passion. So E.J. Cleary is writing her book on women's Gothic, already questioning this particular conception of the female Gothic, often associated with a sort of Radcliffean model. And she says that, of course, we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond this really homogenous conception, and often a conservative conception of what the female Gothic is doing. She says, we find there suggests the need for another story: wild passions, the sublime, supernatural phenomena, violent conflict, murder and torture, sexual excess and perversion, outlandish settings, strange minglings of history and fantasy. And certainly we find this to be the case in a lot of female Gothic author texts, such as Zafloya by Charlotte Dacker, or The Libertines, which we read together. So this sense that these texts can be exploring the female understanding of passion and an understanding of female identity, which moves beyond the societal confines of acceptable femininity. So obviously, once again, very helpful, although, is it always focused on passion? Of course not. So we've looked at a lot of different ways in which the female Gothic can be understood or explored. And to some extent, these are helpful paradigms in underlining some common themes, some particular sort of traditions that we see occurring, links between novels, concerns that novels are engaged with, but ultimately this reproduction of an idea of a female Gothic as to some extent a homogenous category is, I would argue, to some extent quite outdated. It's served its purpose, but it's also now creating a quite distorted conception, both of what was historically going on and a very limiting conception of what women have done and what women are doing within the Gothic. So as Jacqueline Howard notes, such discourses tend to reproduce earlier texts as continually preoccupied with the same problems, so that any real sense of the difference between one historical moment and another is lost. So Howard there is pointing to this from a sort of historical perspective, that these novels are occurring within a particular time frame, and they are replying to, responding to, interacting with specific issues. And these are not all issues about female identity. One of the points that Howard makes is that these are texts which are engaging widely with a variety of contemporary concepts and issues, politics, theology, aesthetics, philosophy, that are not simply limited to an exploration of female experience. And Ellen Ledoux, who I'm really guided by in terms of my understanding of the history of the idea of the female Gothic. So again, as I've noted, we need to place this within when it arose, within the second wave feminism and its reclamation of a female canon. So Ellen suggests that the category female Gothic more accurately reflects the ideological goals of a second wave feminist literary criticism than it represents the narratives of early women Gothic writers. And I think that this is true. So it served a good purpose, but it's a category that we need to move beyond in order to understand the full sort of diversity and complexity of what women authored or women focused texts are doing. So I came up with my subtitle relatively quickly, and I put originally Women in the Gothic and Women's Gothic, but for the rest of the text, I'm not going to be talking about a homogenous or universalized idea of a women's Gothic, but rather focusing on this idea of women in the Gothic as producers, consumers, and foci of Gothic texts. And so that's what I'll be engaging with in terms of the second section, we'll be looking at women in the Gothic, how they're depicted and how they introduce themselves or depict themselves within Gothic literature. So I've been a little bit polemical, so I've got my fighting hedgehog here. If anybody wants to query me, come at me, bro. So there we go. Ooh. So hello, everybody. Does anyone have any questions at this point in the narrative? I don't know if you're talking about hedgehogs, but I'm just going to presume that you are, because that would be accurate. But they're super cute. You guys have been very chatty. I don't know what you've been doing. I don't know if you've been saying like, no, Sam's talking rubbish again. We're mostly shitposting. Okay, cool. It's okay. No, I like it when you guys chat to each other. It's great. But yeah, if you do have any questions or thoughts, then do feel free, because I know that we had quite a long discussion about it this morning. We don't have to have the same discussion, but whether you sort of are convinced by my paradigm. Oh yeah, loads of novels, loads of Gothic novels with non-HEAs, particularly more modern texts, obviously. But we're going to be reading one in a couple of weeks, as we did this week. Hey, the Wyborn and Griffin series, happy endings all around. Jordan promised us a happy ending for the series, which has given me the strength to read that final book. Writers like KJ Charles, for example, a lot of the queer Gothic that's being produced. Yes, so yeah, there definitely are. I mean, obviously when we're talking about an earlier period, there's usually this reproduction of tragedy, as there is in many queer texts, if you're looking at them from the 18th and 19th century. So there's often a sort of reactionary move to punish protagonists that are queer coded, for example. So yes, you quite clearly have sort of a predominant narrative towards a negative ending there. It's stuff like, you know, Carmilla or blah, 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 what's it called? Christabel. They're all producing these quite sad narratives, really. Ooh, which one are you talking about tomorrow, Sherry? Yay, comics. Yes. Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love. I'm excited. Just wanted to say, I was really curious about this presentation because I never thought there was a difference between Gothic novels and female Gothic novels. It's more that there's sort of a paradigm for understanding the female Gothic within Gothic studies. And it's also the point of entry that most people have. So a lot of people in studying the Gothic, they'll study sort of like, you know, an undergrad course or maybe a master's module. And this is sort of one of the arguments or one of the paradigms which is often sort of introduced to the introductory level, although there's like a really sort of strong and long-running engagement with a critique of the female Gothic as a thing. So it's sort of like given as a shorthand for understanding different sort of themes and divisions within the development of the Gothic. But for me, I don't find it a helpful term, and I find it quite a distorting term. Yeah. So, but particularly like that idea of like the Radcliffe novel and the Romance Gothic, if those are female Gothic texts, is definitely there. And particularly in relation to the Gothic romance of the 20th century, the discourse is often about it being, it's not really real Gothic. It's you know, this sort of female Gothic, it's this romance that they've stolen Gothic bits to produce, but it's not real Gothic. So there is that sort of dismissive element sometimes to the use of the label. And I think that's sort of part of the problematic history of it, that it started off with these very good intentions in terms of recovering a female tradition. But inevitably, as it becomes allied to a more formulaic conception of the genre, it becomes more of a pejorative or linked to pejorative kind of commentaries on a sort of female Gothic or a women's Gothic. With looking at how people reacted or interpreted these novels when they came out, help us understand how the genre was understood and perhaps inform how we define it through the ages and today, as opposed to having modern scholars look back and try to figure out a pattern. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's what Ellen Ledoux's essay, that I've retweeted it a couple of times now, but I can retweet it again today. That's what she suggests, basically. She suggests a historical approach to looking at it. And the fact that within the 18th century, there wasn't this conception of a female Gothic. Radcliffe was an incredibly popular and incredibly influential author on both male and female writers. And so you certainly had this association of the Gothic with female readers and female writers, because the majority of writers of Gothic novels in the 18th century were women. So you certainly have that sort of idea, but you don't have this conception of separate traditions. So yeah, I think a historical view is always useful, because it does sort of disrupt a modern framework which we can be enforcing on the novels, which doesn't really reflect reality. Although the other point to mention is that sort of an over-reliance on how it's represented at the time can also be problematic in terms of, say, so a really good example of this is the author that we looked at last week, which is Georgette Heyer, who's often represented both in marketing and commentary and sort of contemporary review as a writer for women. But the historical reality is much closer to her being read widely as well, particularly certain books of hers by men. So there's this sense in which there's this creation of a myth of genre even at the time. And the same with Gothic romance. It's associated with women writers, loads of male writers. It's associated with women consumers. There were also male consumers. So we've got to be careful about that kind of mythologization of genre and division by gender, because there's also that kind of, oh, you read women's books sort of element to the discourse, which is like, no, let's not do that. So yes, okay. I'm fascinated that the documentation proves that the London libraries were frequented more by men, yet were more accused of producing Gothics for women. Documentation can disprove so many myths. Yeah, like everyone convicted of sodomy in the 19th century was hanged. Not true. Not true. No, not true at all. Yeah, I think what you find, so one of the sort of caveats that that Jacobs puts in there is the fact that these subscriptions could be being used by women whose husbands or fathers kind of subscribe to the library. But what we clearly see is a very clear male engagement with circulating libraries, whether they were the only members of their family using that subscription or not. So, and I mean, sort of like the historical evidence for who was reading it, you're reading like the diaries of contemporary writers, and all these men are writing about reading the Gothic, you know? Some of them are shamefaced about it, like, oh, when I was a schoolboy, yes, we used to pass these books around, but no more, I'm a man, I read manly things like Lord Byron. You're like, okay, cool. Nothing about women is real except emotions. True, so true. Yeah, obviously not true if anybody's watching this recording. I was being sarcastic. But good artists borrow, great artists steal. Absolutely true. Okay, I was looking forward to this presentation because I always found a lot of discussions of the female Gothic vaguely annoying, but couldn't articulate why. Especially the idea of all female texts are about the same themes. Yeah, no, I find it deeply annoying as well. I mean, obviously from my research perspective, what I look at is the way in which women were engaging with theological argument in their texts a lot of the time. And to suggest that there's a sort of female argument which runs counter to the proper, serious male discussion of this is just deeply irritating, deeply irritating. Women had to engage with the argument in different ways because of the way that they were banned or excluded from mainstream theological discourse, but they're not engaging with it as women. They're engaging with it perhaps with different perspectives, but they're certainly engaging with it, with the debate itself as equals entering into this debate. Ladies only write about lady things. Yes. Yeah, I mean, of course, Byron was very popular with the ladies as well, lady writing. But like, there's that weird distinction that you find in sort of Gothic in Romantic writers for the period of Romanticism, where they're like, oh, the Gothic, that's for women, but Romanticism, that's a manly genre. And you're like, okay, cool. It's often the same, but cool, yeah. So that's just my perspective. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions at the moment, I can go on to the second section, a bit more of a historical view of what's actually happening with women in these texts, if everybody's ready for that. Okay, so just let you appreciate my hedgehog gif a little second longer, and on. So I'm not going to be producing a complete overview of the way in which heroines are depicted in this period. I'm going to be giving you a short intro to sort of how they're appearing in these early Gothic texts. But then we're going to be looking at a case study, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, and we're going to be looking at the particularities and complexities of her depiction of women within that text. So the compulsory Otranto slide. Hello. So obviously, again, we're going back to Otranto, but what I'm wanting to talk about is the way in which in these very early Gothic novels, women appeared often not really as protagonists, but as sort of ciphers within the text. So there are 3 women in the Castle of Otranto: Hippolyta, Manfred's wife; Isabella, who was meant to be marrying his son Conrad, who got squished by the helmet, and so is now the sort of the object of his pursuit; and Matilda, his daughter. And they are, and I was very proud of this when I came up with it about 4 a.m., divorced, bewedded, and died at the end of the novel. So Hippolyta isn't actually divorced, I think. I'm not quite sure how it worked out at the end, but Manfred wishes to divorce her so that he can marry Isabella. Isabella is eventually wedded to Theodore, the hero, who we thought was a peasant, but is actually the true heir of the castle, and Matilda is killed by her father. So there's very little sort of subjectivity to these characters throughout most of the novel. They're often quite reactive to the situation rather than engaging in sort of any active or autonomous action. So Hippolyta, for example, reacts to the demand for divorce with an acquiescence. Isabella reacts to the threat by fleeing. Matilda's perhaps the most autonomous in terms of she goes against her father's dictates and has this sort of quasi-romance with Theodore, in that she sees him once and they're both like, ah. But that's about it. And obviously her reactive moment is she gets stabbed and so she dies. That's most of what she does in the text. So there's also a sense in which these characters are also sort of fairly replaceable with each other, that these women are just sort of objects of persecution or admiration for the male subjects of the text. So Hippolyta, for example, is replaced with Isabella by Manfred, or he wishes to replace her with Isabella. In terms of Matilda, Matilda is killed because she's mistaken for Isabella. And in the end, of course, Theodore weds Isabella as a sort of a bad stand-in for Matilda, his beloved, who dies. So in the most romantic ending to a novel ever, we're told that Frederick offered his daughter to the new prince, which Hippolyta's tenderness for Isabella concurred to promote. But Theodore's grief was too fresh to admit to the thought of another love, and it was not until after frequent discourses with Isabella of his dear Matilda that he was persuaded he could know no happiness but in the society of one with whom he could forever indulge the melancholy that had taken possession of his soul. So essentially, Isabella becomes a living ghost within the text, a sort of facsimile or stand-in for Matilda, which is a pretty sad ending there, but is a good example of how the women in this text are not exactly fleshed out, shall we say. Also, in early Gothic text authored by women, you'll often find that these female figures are not the focus of the novel. So in The Old English Baron by Clara Reeve, the hero Edmund, who is another sort of peasant hero, who's not really, he's the usurped heir of the castle, is the focus of the narrative. And he has a love object called Emma the Fair, who is sort of his adopted foster sister of sorts. And that's what she is. She's fair. She does a lot of sort of soft sighing in the background and like, be safe, my love. And that's about it. There is a sort of problem with their relationship in that there's a presumed class difference, so it can't happen. But then at the end, it can happen, and that's about all she does. And in the castles of Athlin and Nambain as well, you have more female characters, but again, they're not really active protagonists in the story. Again, it's focused on the male protagonists of the novel, Alan and Osbert. Mary is Osbert's sister and Laura is his lady love, and they basically just spend the novel being kidnapped by different people. Mary's kidnapped twice by different people, amazingly, and Laura is held kidnapped for basically the entirety of her life, and they just have to sort of wait to be rescued. Mary's luckier because she's waiting for the apparently peasant hero Alan, so he actually does something and rescues her. And Laura's waiting for Osbert, so she has to wait till the end of the novel to be freed by Alan. There we go. When we have a bit of a turn towards a real interest and investigation of female protagonists is in The Recess by Sophia Lee, 1783. So the generic categorization of this as Gothic is less obvious in the works we've been looking at, but it does feature this particular narrative of female oppression, and it's a sort of historical reimagining. which features Matilda and Eleanor, the two daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, they're not real in real life, but they're invented for the sake of this novel. So it's an alternate history. And it's sort of the tale of their vicissitudes and eventually their marriages to Leicester and Essex, respectively. Favourites, of course, of Queen Elizabeth, who is thoroughly rejected by the novel as a character, as a person, as a monarch. And we also have Matilda, I think, and Leicester's daughter Mary. I could have gotten that wrong. I could have assigned her to the wrong couple there. But sort of one of the main reasons which this novel is recognised or known, particularly as Gothic, is the fact that these two princesses, or quasi-princesses, are brought up in a space called the Recess, which is an underground series of cabins and caves which have partly been constructed by man under the house which their sort of benefactress and quasi-mother, Mrs. Marlowe, lives in or owns or has the care of. And there they are both entrapped and protected from the vengeance of Queen Elizabeth, for example. So what we see happening in this novel is a concentration on first-person narrators from a female perspective. So we have we've got to think about this within the sort of history of the novel. We're still in the spirit of experimentation. We're still sort of moving away from the dominance of the epistolary novel in the mid-18th century. So this is constructed of a number of very long letters. And we get the perspective of both Eleanor and Matilda as the dominant perspectives. But what's particularly interesting is that there's a polyphonic sort of effect of these voices. Sorry, my brain will not think of the word there. So a polyphony refers to the critical concept of Bakhtin, which talks about the way in which, or is a discussion of the way in which multiple voices are heard in a text. So true polyphony occurs when these voices are equal and independent. And that's what we get in Sophia Lee's The Recess, because we have these letters from the different sisters giving their own perspectives. And what we find when we move from the letters or writing of one sister to the other are there are significant points of discrepancy between their interpretation of events. And so we have these two conceptions of the events of the story from two very different perspectives. So there's a real sort of interrogation of there being very much not one single female perspective to be had. After they leave the Recess, they have lives of vicissitude and adventure. And these are sort of really much more out there, much more traumatic than we're used to, perhaps, in what we consider to be the Gothic of the period. One of them is held captive in Jamaica for 8 years. Another is forcibly married to somebody. Both of them see the deaths of their beloveds. They're also involved in court intrigue. And the focus of the novel, really, it does it a disservice to say that it's simply focused on women's experience, because there's a great deal of interaction with sort of the contemporary court politics, politics more generally, and this kind of reimagination or understanding of history. What's perhaps really interesting about this novel is what it underlines as a fairly common theme, arguably in this early British Gothic, of this idea of these religious and patriarchal spaces as spaces of both safety and entrapment. So the Recess is a space both of safety and entrapment for these heroines. And we see this kind of motif coming up again and again within the Gothic. So convents often become spaces perhaps of retreat and safety, but also where women are locked away from society. And we also have this idea with a figure such as Montoni as a representation sort of a patriarchal tyrant who is both persecutor and at one point in the text protector of Emily. So we have this kind of investigation of that sort of that tense relationship to these power structures. So we've talked about some of the sort of the existing depictions of women in the Gothic. Now let's move on to Radcliffe, and we're going to do a bit of a deep dive. I've brought up 3 different topics, the ones that are in the title of the talk: heroines, wives, and demons. And we're going to investigate the characters in this novel through those different lenses. So let me introduce you to the heroine of The Mysteries of Udolpho. Her name is Emily St-Aubert. She was born in La Valais and she will be returning there, but she's currently touring / kidnapped in Italy. She likes wild wood walks. She loves that sublime landscape, the terra sublime at the beginning. She also loves inappropriately timed poetry, terrible men, swooning, obeying her father, drawing the view, keeping hold of her inheritance, chastity and hats, modesty hats, of course. And she dislikes superstitious talk. Well, sometimes, when she's not indulging in it herself. So the model of heroinism which Emily is allied with is that of sensibility. And if you're not aware of what sensibility is or its existence, it's an 18th century discourse, which is all about sort of heightened emotion and the importance of emotion, both in terms of moral decision-making and in terms of character, in terms of susceptibility. So it emphasizes emotional receptivity, and the way in which emotion gives you access to higher realities and greater virtue. So a lot of the discussion that you might see on sensibility, particularly as it relates to gender in the 18th century, is channeled through a focus on feminist writers like Mary Wollstonecraft's indictment of sensibility as a method through which women were, or femininity was policed and women were controlled. And there is a certain extent, particularly towards the end of the century, that sensibility was overwhelmingly employed to monitor the behavior of women. However, as I've talked about before, sensibility was not simply a gendered discourse. It was allied to a much wider philosophical argument and understanding of the role of emotion in both character and morality, etc. And so what we find in Radcliffe is this engagement with a degendered conception of sensibility, and she produces it as a model of behavior for both her heroes and her heroines. If we're thinking about this sort of degendered nature of the discourse, something that I think is a really good place to start in discussion of this is by looking at Saint-Aubert's lengthy screed about sensibility, which he gives to Emily on his deathbed. So her father on his deathbed starts to talk about the dangers of sensibility. So in Mysteries of Udolpho, we're engaging with sensibility as a potential positive, but also as, when uncontrolled, a dangerous force. So he says that it's a dangerous quality which is continually extracting the excess of misery or delight from every surrounding circumstance, and notes that she must be able to control herself and dominate or coordinate, in a sense, her sensibility with rationality, because happiness arises in a state of peace, not of emotional tumult. And so but he also notes that they can no more exist in a heart, that is, happiness can no more exist in a heart that is continually alive to minute circumstances than in one that is dead to feeling. So here he's warning against the excesses of sensibility, but also against the excesses of insensibility as well. So what I've always found interesting is the way in which this discourse from Saint-Aubert echoes the male Humean discourse addressed to men of the delicacy of passion and the delicacy of taste. Now, I've put some quotes here, but I do recommend looking it up, because when you see the argument in full, it's much clearer the way in which these two texts are interacting. But Hume lays out the delicacy of passion as something which some are subject to, which makes them extremely sensible to all the accidents of life and gives them a lively joy upon every prosperous event, as well as a piercing grief when they meet with misfortunes and adversity, the excess of misery or delight for an uncontrolled sensibility. But he argues there's also a delicacy of taste, which much resembles the delicacy of passion and produces the same sensibility, but it's to beauty and deformity of every kind, rather than the prosperity and adversary obligations and injuries. Now here, beauty and deformity isn't just talking about aesthetic beauty and deformity, it's talking about moral beauty and deformity, the sort of wider conception of what beauty and deformity can mean. But in this sense, delicacy of taste is something that can be, for Hume, honed. It can be subjugated to sort of reason, experience and control, and it can be molded, it can be worked upon. And it's about a response to beauty and deformity rather than being sort of tossed about by the winds of fortune and change. So this is the distinction that Saint-Aubert is making. This is the distinction that he is telling Emily to follow, and which by the end of the novel, at the end of her Bildungsroman, she has accomplished. She has accomplished sort of subjugating her delicacy of passion to a delicacy of taste. The person who hasn't, of course, is Valancourt. So we can see this warning also applying to Valancourt, but not being heeded. He is a subject often to a delicacy of passion, which causes him to respond with emotional excess to events, unable to control himself. Also, Hume warns that A delicacy of passion will often lead us into immorality as we're led by our emotions. And guess what happens to Valancourt? His excessive despair leads him into a profligate lifestyle. So we have this idea already forming of Emily as a heroine of sensibility, but sensibility not here as simply a gendered discourse. What I think is also very evident in her journey, her buildings around, and particularly we see this when we look at the theoaesthetic coding that I did mention a little bit last week, is this articulation of a claim for sublime subjectivity for Emily within the text. So sublime subjectivity rather than the beautiful objectivity. So she's a sublime subject rather than simply the beautiful object of regard. So how does she claim to herself, or how does Radcliffe claim for her this sublime subjectivity? Well, Emily not only speaks, but dominates the language of the sublime. She also demonstrates through her use of her poetry, her original genius as a manifestation of the sublime. Now you'll be thinking, what has original genius in poetry got to do with mountains and the sublime? Well, the sublime as a discourse originates, of course, in the more ancient writings of Longinus. And he was talking not simply about the description of natural landscapes, but about rhetoric and oratory, about the production of texts. And this is a common theme and discussion in the discourse of the sublime throughout the 18th century, one which we're not as used to looking at because of the sort of emphasis on Burke and on sublime landscape. But this idea of the production of sublimity in oratory, in rhetoric, in literature is one which is allied with Emily, who through her poetry claims that to herself. And there's, I think is it Cleary or is it right? There's a really good analysis of the nymph poem to sort of underline that as a sort of point of the text. Also, in terms of sublime subjectivity, we're going to have to look at the moral sublime. So this is another aspect of sublime discourse, the idea that there is a moral sublime and a moral beautiful, if we're making those binary distinctions, which Burke so enjoys. So as we can see here, Burke differentiates between the sublime and the beautiful, and he aligns certain values or moral properties with the sublime and then with the beautiful. So the sublime is all about fortitude, justice, and wisdom, and beauty is about a sense of loveliness, the easiness of temper, compassion, kindness, and liberality. I'm not the first, nor will I be the last critic to note here that there is an obvious gendering of the way in which the sublime and the beautiful are differentiated in Burke, not only here, but sort of very directly. He talks about women are beautiful, not sublime. And so we have usually this separation with a sort of sublimity allied with masculinity and masculine values, and femininity allied with the beautiful and feminine values. And so there's a complete sort of erasure of sublime, the sublime female. And I've got a little example of it here in art. This is Judith, obviously, killing Holofernes. So the biblical narrative of Judith who stands up against, or who kills the leader of the enemy army while he's sleeping. Interestingly, this is a portrait by a female painter, and it does sort of represent very clearly this sort of female moral sublimity, rather than the sort of delicate that you get in some of the male painted portraits of this moment. So if you could sort of just lightly scrape through somebody's neck. Anywho, so bear that in mind, this differentiation that occurs. And we're going to see throughout that Emily is allied with a sublime subjectivity, with those masculine qualities, but we're also sort of looking at the ways in which this discourse of sublime and beautiful virtue are also aligned with the contemporary discourse of Christian virtue, and this outlined by Addison of the man of faith, who has his light and support within him, that are able to cheer his mind and bear him up in the midst of all those horrors which encompass him. He knows that his helper is at hand and is always nearer to him than anything else can be, which is capable of annoying or terrifying him. In the midst of calumny or contempt, he attends to that being who whispers better things within his soul, and whom he looks upon as his defender, his glory, and the lifter of his head. So we can see here this alignment of this kind of man of faith, this gender discourse around morality, potentially, it aligns with that sort of conception of sublime moral virtues, the fortitude and wisdom, etc. And what we find in the Mysteries of Udolpho, and I'll just quote myself here, is that both beautiful and sublime virtues are found in both sexes that are represented in Udolpho. Valancourt displays compassion and liberality to the shepherd family and Banach. Emily shows wisdom, justice, and fortitude, specifically in her rejection of Valancourt after she returns from the castle of Udolpho and learns about Valancourt's fall from grace. She understands it differently than it actually happened, but instead of submitting to his pleas, instead of allowing herself to become the beautiful object of the narrative, Emily's decision is a point of the fruition of her journey that she's undergone through the text. It's a final choice to be not the beautiful object, but the sublime object, autonomous, individual, and claiming for herself that sublime subjectivity. And Emily becomes a model of a degendered Christian subject, morally sublime and claiming to herself the spark of divinity often reserved for men in theological and aesthetic discourses of the period. So constructing Emily as a degendered Christian subject, at least in the moral sphere, fulfills the biblical promise that in Christ there is no male and female. So there you go. That's what we find occurring in Radcliffe. So we've moved from the heroines. Let's have a look at wives as a category. Now, of course, within these, the most famous narratives of Radcliffe, the happily ever after is connected with the status of wife. Marriage and economic security are found at the same time, and financial independence, which is voluntarily surrendered. So something that's notable about Radcliffe is the way in which her novels offer a fantasy of female economic and financial independence for the time, in which the female characters are always inheritors, or almost always inheritors of wealth or of property. And at the end of the novel, after everybody's been trying to take it away from them, they voluntarily render it up to the worthy husband. But there is this sort of sense of the happy ending of the wife, but then the texts themselves, throughout the rest of the body of the text, show a very uncomfortable kind of reflection on the position and reality of marriage and wives in the period. So Ruth Annalix suggested that Radcliffe warns her readers of the true threat to women in her text. It's a little bit reductive here, but she does point to some useful ideas. That the husband and father excessively empowered under the systems of coverture and primogeniture. So primogeniture is not really the focus today, but obviously the idea that the first son inherits. And we do see this explored in the position that this puts women in, for example, a Sicilian romance, where the two daughters are basically ignored in favor of the son, and their only worth is as sort of marriageable daughters, and that's what leads to the persecution of Julia. Coverture is more widely sort of relevant, and we have, if you're not aware of coverture and what it is in terms of the legal concept of coverture, we have the femme covert and the femme sole. I'm not quite sure how you're meant to pronounce those. But basically this idea that once married, you become a femme covert, covered by your husband's identity. There's this legal fiction that two become one, and that literally you are sort of legally erased upon marriage. You can no longer own property on your own. You can no longer sign contracts. Those possibilities are open to the femme sole, the single woman, but not to the married woman. And there is this investigation frequently in Radcliffe's text of this sort of idea of coverture and this erasure of female identity. So the most obvious is in one of her more juvenile works, A Sicilian Romance, where, as we've talked about before, the wife is locked up for years and years in the cellar. And we have a sort of literalization there of coverture, where the wife is effectively erased by her marriage from legal and civil society. In Udolpho, we have various wives. Madame Saint-Aubert has a positive relationship with her husband, but she basically disappears from the text, erased from it, and her husband's identity covers her own. So Emily, after both of her parents' death, the only one she talks about really for the rest of the novel is her father. Her mother simply disappears. The Marchioness de Villeroy is her aunt, and obviously she was killed by her husband, or by her husband and his lover. And the Countess de Villefort, the Countess, is capricious and unhappy in her marriage. She's not representing necessarily here definitely the disempowerment of women within marriage, although to some extent, if you're wanting to read between the lines. But she's certainly quite a domineering character. But what you're seeing is not a positive reflection on marriage as an institution. So moving on to that last category, demons. Obviously, we do not have a real demon in Radcliffe, but we do have the sort of the demonized woman or the dark double. So Laurentini di Udolpho is Emily's dark double within the narrative. She was the original owner of the castle of Udolpho, and she was also the murderer of Emily's aunt through jealousy. She married her because she killed her because she was married to Laurentini's lover. And you have this echoing again of that discourse of sensibility and delicacy of passion. So Hume has said, as I mentioned in relation to Valancourt, that men of such lively passions are apt to be transported beyond all bounds of prudence and discretion, and to take false steps in the conduct of life which are often irretrievable. Now we see this warning coming up and being reproduced by Laurentini on her deathbed to Emily herself. Sister, beware of the first indulgence of the passions, beware of the first. Their course, if not checked then, is rapid, their force is uncontrollable. They lead us, we know not whither. They lead us perhaps to the commission of crimes for which whole years of prayer and penitence cannot atone. Indeed, never have sex before marriage, or you will inevitably end up murdering somebody. Facts. But what we see here, of course, is this sense that Laurentini is what Emily could have become or could become if she allowed herself to be dominated by her emotional impulses. We also, of course, very clearly have here that connection of the sort of the monstrous feminine with an uncontrolled sexuality. So is this a standard? Are these kind of portrayals of the heroine, wife, and mother a standard across the genre? No, obviously not. They might be reoccurring, but I think particularly in terms of the heroine, there's a lot of complexity in Radcliffe that's maybe not always apparent. But it's not simply a question of complexity or simplicity. These texts are engaging with specific ideas and arguments in their production of their heroines, wives, mothers, and female protagonists and antagonists. So is it a standard across Radcliffe's work? No. As we can see in perhaps the mirrored heroines in texts like The Romance of the Forest, where Adeline meets the daughter of Leluc. They're on very different paths, very different journeys, very different positions on those journeys. Similarly for Emily and Blanche in The Mysteries of Udolpho, that we have multiple heroines within one novel who are not the same person. We have different depictions of the female. So last week I talked about the St. Albans Abbey with wives to the rescue, where she rides across the battlefield to offer succor to her husband. In terms of like the depiction of demons, demonic females, obviously in the case of Laurentini, there's this emphasis on lust and passion. But what we have in the depiction of Madame Vivaldi in the Italian, for example, is about power and pride and sort of aristocratic holding on to that position, not wanting it to be polluted by somebody from a lower class. So you certainly see within Radcliffe, I think, not always a reflection on sort of gendered inequalities so much as a reflection on the corruption of structures of power more generally. Wives who rule the roost, you find arguably in The Mysteries of Udolpho, certainly in the Italian, and most obviously in a Sicilian romance where the second wife rules the roost while the first wife is locked away in a cabin. In terms of across the genre, do we find only one type of heroine? Of course not. This is a bit of an outlier, but she's one of my favourites. Prostitute heroines in The Castle of St. Donats, of course. It's a male-focused story, but one of the characters is as a prostitute who helps the main hero escape and gets her own happy ending. Sympathetic demons, I'm referring here to the novel Zofloya by Charlotte Dacker. Now, sympathetic, it's a sort of reverse, it's a female Ambrosio story, so it's a descent into lust, murder, crime, being thrown off a cliff by a demon, and the protagonist is certainly punished by the text. But although there is this conservative sort of move towards punishment at the end, the depiction of Zofloya is more complicated than simply a look at this sexy woman, she gets punished for it. In terms of the narrative effects, so there's a very overt and intrusive narrator in Zofloya who is often offering condemnation, but it becomes to a great extent performative. And we do find this distinction between Victoria's own judgments on the situation, which differ from that of the narrator. But when looked at by the reader, it becomes clear that Victoria's judgments are perhaps more solid than the narrators. This is particularly true in reference to Berenza, her husband, where the narrator is constantly praising him and attempting to portray sort of the villainy of Victoria and rejecting his kindness to her. But Victoria notes at one point when she's expressing her hate to him, he is a man who seduced me when I was underage, and he had no intention of marrying me. And then it's just the facts. That's just what happened. So there's this sense that perhaps there's a dissonance between the narratorial voice and the authorial voice. There is quite clearly an investigation and depiction of female passion as existing and legitimate. And there's a number of critics, including the peasant Kimi Mikoshaw, who wrote the introduction to, I think it's the Oxford edition, discussing the fact that perhaps, just perhaps, Charlotte Dacre is a little bit on the devil's side in this one. We also find a distinction between different heroines. We have working class heroines and a depiction of the different realities which are faced by them. In, for example, The Castle of Montabino, I think it's by, is it Sarah Lawrenson? Sarah something. It's a short one. It's only like 27 pages. It's a chapbook. But in the Castle of Montabino, you have a trader's daughter from an upper echelon, but it's very particularly noted how she's related to trade and not properly aristocratic. And then you also have a silversmith or a goldsmith's daughter, and their relationships with the same man and their sort of persecution by the same man. But you have certainly this interrogation of how they're affected differently by their class. One character is imprisoned in her own castle and sort of manipulated by her husband. The other character, the character with the lower class, is tricked into a fake marriage and position of mistress and then disowned. So you have this sense of the dangers and possibilities which ring around these characters based on their different class positions. You also have in texts which appear to offer heroines exactly like those of Radcliffe, these sensibility heroines, very different presentations and interrogations of that heroine. So in the example of the Children of the Abbey, our heroine is put to the test, but not refined by fire. So what we find in the depiction of Radcliffe's heroines, particularly Emily St. Aubert, is this sense in which the heroine has changed by the end of the novel, has developed and undergone a Bildungsroman. Whereas what we get in the Children of the Abbey is an already perfected heroine who has to undergo trial after trial after trial after trial after trial, and then is rewarded with a terrible husband. Yay! But she's not improved or changed by this process. She rather has to survive it to prove her worth. The last one, of course, is a different novel of women's position that is offered by a text like Ethel Weiner, where Ethel Weiner is in fact sort of the ruler of that land because her brothers disappeared. And we see her as a woman in charge, taking her place, sort of presiding over a court and commanding men. So there's a certain sense in which the idea of the weak, passive heroine is not really an accurate description of her, even though she's a persecuted heroine within her own text. So as you can see, plenty of diversity, plenty of difference. Each text should be assessed on its own basis, of course, rather than presuming there's this kind of homogeneity to it. So, time for a pause. Hello. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. Any questions, any thoughts? I don't know what you're talking about, whether disdain or murder is a suitable response to something. I don't know what my Freudian slip was, oh no.
Which is the appropriate response to bad sex, disdain or murder?
Murder, no. I don't know, not out of my wheelhouse. I'm going to say disdain. But I don't want this to be like, you know, listening in. This is what they get me for. You're advocating for the murder of men for bad sex. No, it wasn't, I promise. No. Was there ever any public outcry about some of Anne Radcliffe's themes or heroines? No, not with Anne Radcliffe, really. She was the respectable face of the Gothic of the period. So she was usually, if you're looking at writers talking about her, she was usually the exception to the rule, very specifically framed as the exception to the rule. So she was the good one, and she had these servile imitators. Although, of course, it doesn't mention the fact that some of the texts predate her. You're like, interesting. And the fact that, like, I mean, I keep focusing on Radcliffe because she was the subject of my study, but particularly as I kept going through my studies, it became really apparent that there were writers that were just as popular at the time. They were writing simultaneously or slightly before, slightly after, who were arguably just as impactful on the field, but less recognized, and also sort of dismissed because they weren't that exception. So one of the parts of the Ellen Ledoux article is the fact that Radcliffe was reclaimed specifically because she already had male approval within the 19th century. So just as a sort of aside there. Blah, 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 blah. You mentioned the biblical text about there will be no difference between men and women. Was that a commonly mentioned text in the period? It depends what discourse you're talking about, really. I mean, this idea of soul equality was something that you would hear more about as a sort of future promise. But of course, it was more taken up by sort of women engaging with theology and using it as a conception or defense of their own activity within the theological sphere, from which they were largely prohibited from sort of functioning at an equal level with men at the very least. So yeah. I mean, also, you've got to place that text within its context, because it's also the one that says, you know, there's no slave or free man, there's no Gentile or Greek. So if you're looking at the abolitionary context as well of the 1790s, then that was a sort of verse that was in people's minds in terms of how we can discuss some of the sort of discussion around abolition. Sorry, just Eric's comment there. Thank them for that. Are we bringing back the pillory and pelting people with rotten tomatoes? Oh, that wasn't for me. Sorry. Who needs a pillory when there's Twitter? There is that. You're just having a tomato-based discussion, okay? What? On theme here. On theme, guys.
That was our discussion on public disdain for bad sex.
No, I got it. I did enjoy though. Spent so much time dissecting this as the key issue of today's talk. But how do we deal with bad sex? Yeah, don't know. Does anyone have another question? Were there ever any Gothics when a demon woman run out? Not in the early period, really, sadly. Although you could suggest that Matilda in the Monk wins. Because obviously at the end, Ambrosio is the one who has his downfall, and Matilda / Rosario / the demon is like in the background. Victory. Oh my gosh. Bloodthirsty. You all are bloodthirsty. Yes, survival is happily ever after. That's very sort of Russian Gothic for me. Like, that's the best you can hope for. Your life's been shattered, but at least you're, mostly speaking, still alive. Yeah, also true. Okay, so if there are no questions at the moment, I'll go in and do the last bit. If I go over, my apologies. I didn't this morning, so I'm hopeful I can do this, but I might not. So let's see. If you do have to leave, obviously, I understand. Do feel free. You can catch the very end on the YouTube, but do stay if you can. So there we go. Oh, okay. Let's just go on to the slide. So what I'm looking at now is the way in which these sort of women's writing in the Gothic focused on women is developing from this point onwards. I'm not trying to suggest there is a single narrative of this. I'm looking at one particular sort of text and then looking at what offshoots from it and the changes that we see. But I am going to produce something of a general movement in this first part. So the text that I'm going to be looking at is Jane Eyre. And this idea that I'm going to offer is this sort of general movement in terms of how the heroine positions herself and how the text understands her. So we had in the first part this discussion of Emily St. Aubert and this idea of a claimed sublime subjectivity, which is inherently coded within the text. But what we're finding in the Bronte books, certainly, is this overt claim for equal status, not simply this sort of spiritual equality, but based in that concept of spiritual equality. And in Jane Eyre, we have this doctrine of the equality of the disembodied, which is what Helen talks about in school. But we have Jane living this out and making those claims overtly for herself. So this move away from the heroine as reactionary or passive, reacting to her fate, and instead claiming it, and making claims, making a stand for her own positioning. So the famous, of course, discourse here, when Rochester's being a muppet, as per usual. Do you think because I am pure, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You're wrong. You think wrong. I have as much soul as you and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. I'm not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, nor even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet equal as we are. So, this is a very overt claim for that position of equality. And we see this also played out in one of the movements of the text, which is the refusing of the role of Cinderella. So there's a way in which Jane Eyre has been read, particularly in how it's reproduced in later narratives, particularly how it's sort of reused or interacted with in perhaps the Gothic romance, and arguably in some of the television adaptations, which turn into a form of Cinderella story in which somebody struggling from a lower class is sort of lifted up and offered a sort of higher social status, and undergoes this kind of Cinderella movement, which arguably subsumes their original identity. Now, all the way through, Jane has been claiming her equality, but also has been making claims about her very nature, about her autonomy, about her desire for things, her desire for a particular type of life, for a particular form of freedom. She's also, of course, recognized the limits of what she can achieve on her own and longs for things which she doesn't believe she can have. But she's created for herself a very clear sense of identity, and it's one which she refuses to relinquish to the sort of masterful Rochester. So we have this discourse when he's first being all sort of like lovey-dovey and slightly gross after the proposal. He's talking about her as a bird and a fairy and etc., and trying to rain jewels upon her. And she says, "Oh, sir, I never rain jewels. I don't like to hear them spoken of. Jewels for Jane Eyre are natural and strange. I would rather not have them." So there's a sense here, of course, of self-deprecation, but there's also this refusal to become sort of the beggar maid to his king. And there's just refusal to render up her subjectivity within the novel. And we see her making these decisions time and time again. And most notably, of course, after the abortive marriage occurs. And he comes to her and says, "Jane, you understand what I want of you. Just this promise, I will be yours, Mr. Rochester." And her response is, "I will not be yours." And of course, she makes the decision to leave there, and a refusal to render up her sense of autonomy and her sense of individual identity, her sense of moral identity as well. So another character within the text who is obviously worthy of interrogation is Bertha Mason. And I'm going to be talking about the inherent polyphony of Gothic madness in a second, but I'm not going to be directly engaging with a very varied particular critique of the problematic textual assumptions which are associated with Bertha. I think they're fairly evident and fairly obviously problematic. The racism, xenophobia, and ableism which are involved in the depiction of Bertha quite clearly. So some of the sort of critical interventions about Bertha in the Jane Eyre narrative, such as that by Gilbert and Gabar, have presented Bertha as a sort of version of the monstrous feminine, both a sort of dark double and a reflection of Jane and what she is attempting to also to reject through her use of self-control. So it's an interesting reading, but something for me that is sort of problematic about this conception simply of Bertha as a dark double is this conception which erases her individuality, subjectivity, story, and voice from the narrative as anything other than a reflection of Jane. So it's a problematic reading for me. What I sort of want to do in looking at Bertha is investigate how she appears in the text from a sort of narratological point of view. So what is going on with her appearance in the text and how it affects our understanding of the narrative and the existing characters. So this is the sort of critical concept I'm going to talk to you about for a second, the polyphony of madness. So I've already introduced the idea of polyphony earlier on and the idea of there being multiple voices in the text. Now, true polyphony includes voices which are equal and independent, and we don't have that within Jane Eyre. But arguably, the introduction of any other voices within a text, whether it's through the use, for example, of direct speech, etc., a reflection on their views, offers a form of minor polyphony. And what we find in Gothic texts, and particularly Gothic fantastic texts, which are often asking that question of, am I mad or is it real? So things like The Sandman by Hoffman, Pico by Adama or Queen of Spades by Pushkin, and even Lovecraftian narratives. Although obviously there the question, is it mad or is it real, is like, I'm mad and it's real a lot of the time. But this introduction of madness in a text is the automatic introduction of polyphony within a text, because there are at least two versions of reality which are being presented, addressed or understood as occurring within the text when we have a generically mad character. Now again, I'm not going to be discussing this. I'm not discussing this madness as a form of any sort of historically accurate or medically accurate representation of any mental health condition. It's not. What I'm looking at here is madness as a narrative technique. So in those fantastic texts, madness becomes this automatic polyphony. We have two possible interpretations of reality. Within Jane Eyre, we also see Bertha's madness as a form of polyphony. And although she can't speak herself, or she doesn't, we hear only a fiendish laugh, yells and cries. So she doesn't speak to us as an audience with words. The madness itself offers a form of inherent polyphony within the text. And her actions speak for her, perform the voice of that polyphony. And through her attacks on Rochester, Mason, and the Vale. And these attacks on Rochester and Mason and the Vale offer a different interpretation of these characters and objects, who they are or what they symbolize. So the attack on Rochester suggests a much more negative reading of Rochester. Similarly, her attack on Mason and this element of sort of familial betrayal. And of course, she rends Jane's veil in two, which can easily be conceived of as an attack on or cry out against marriage, which is what has effectively entrapped her in a living nightmare. So am I just being a bit optimistic by suggesting that this kind of inherent critique appears to some extent in the text? I don't think I am. What I'm not saying, though, is that it's all right. Charlotte Bronte was aware this is definitely a critique of Rochester, it's a condemnation. No, it's not. But it does this, the madness of Bertha actually succeeds in producing something in the text, which is an unease with this kind of dominant narrative or reading of Rochester, or certainly with Rochester's narrative and reading of himself as he presents it to us. So there are some aspects which give strength to this kind of more sympathetic understanding of Bertha, a more problematic understanding of Rochester. Jane at one point rebukes him and says, you treat her cruelly, you speak of her cruelly. So we have that. Obviously she doesn't actually stand up for Bertha in any more meaningful way, but we have this slight critique. We also have the fact that although the treatment of Bertha in terms of the confinement in the family home is in keeping with contemporary practice, the way that she's treated is not in keeping with contemporary theory about how to benefit or treat the mad. And it's particularly interesting. There's quite a lot of debate, and you can debate about what Charlotte Bronte knew or how she interacted with this idea of the treatment of the mad. Because she might well have been aware of more contemporary discourse, and particularly, for example, the Quaker asylum at York, which had a very different kind of conception of madness and how it should be treated. Not unproblematic, but it was based on ideas of community and productivity rather than on confinement and control. So you have this potential reflection in the text of that this is a knowing reflection of the fact that this is not best practice, obviously. And you also have this sort of interesting recognition of the inhumanity of her treatment. So you see, in her countenance, I saw a change. In his countenance, I saw a change. So Jane is talking about Rochester here after this sort of the revelation. She says, that looks desperate and brooding, that reminded me of some wronged and fettered wild beast or bird, dangerous to approach in his sullen woe. So there's a clear echoing here in this portrayal of Rochester, of the situation of Bertha, who has become bestialized by the text, is depicted as beastly. Now, there's obviously a racial element to that, but also there's this sense of this is what happens. This is what you do to somebody when you chain and confine them in this way. So, as I say, I'm not arguing that this is a text which is unproblematic in its depiction of Bertha, not at all. But I think what we quite often miss is the fact that this production of madness in the text does offer an implicit critique of Rochester, from which he must save himself, from which he must be redeemed. He has to redeem himself to some extent in the narrative, both through his what happens to him physically and the textual punishment, but also in terms of his attempt to save Bertha, for example. Now, of course, we have, in the Wide Sargasso Sea, we have a rewriting of Bertha's story more particularly. And I've put this alongside Toni Morrison's Beloved, not because they're both rewriting a specific text, but what we're seeing here, and I'm just using these two examples briefly because this is a brief section, is the potential for the Gothic to be used by women, and particularly women of colour, to engage with a rewriting or investigation of these racially inflected wrongs as well. So there's a sense in which I'll be talking about in terms of class as well. Often our conception of the Gothic and the female Gothic is inflected unknowingly by this conception of a very white middle class identity. But what these novels centre is a very different experience, and in which this kind of idea that female Gothic texts are always concentrating on female experience is exposed as being a very clear lack of any sort of intersectional comprehension of a female Gothic, or a women's Gothic, or a women in the Gothic. So in Wide Sargasso Sea, it's the prehistory of Bertha, and we see this emphasis on the traumatic racism, her displacement to a foreign country, the mental health and mental disintegration, and of course, spousal abuse. And the text is used to sort of rewrite the Jane Eyre narrative through the perspective of Bertha as the mistreated wife, and also through this investigation of the racism of the text. In Toni Morrison, of course, in Beloved, you have the story of Seth, who has escaped from slavery, and there is a ghost that haunts her house, which eventually becomes a person called Beloved. I'm not going to tell you the identity in case you haven't read it. I don't want to spoil the story for you. But what is interrogated here is sort of a female interrelations, mother and daughter relations particularly, although there's a wider interrogation of family, but also the realities and lasting legacies of slavery. And also this kind of sense of a different integration or investigation of love, or love without caveat, through sort of love in or through trauma. So moving on to another sort of subsection of what we can see sort of coming out of Jane Eyre, or sort of interesting pathways which we can follow from Jane Eyre, is, as I've already mentioned, this sort of idea of the heroine as active agent of her own destiny, rather than simply a reactionary heroine. So Jane obviously has to react to various events in the text, but we also find her planning her future, taking that step away from the school to finding a position for herself, trying to claim the destiny that she wants for herself at various times. We also find her as an active figure, both sort of literally in terms of rescuing Rochester from the first fire, also morally in terms of the decision that she makes to break from Rochester, in terms of her activity in the school, and then of course in her ultimate choice to return. And in terms of this idea of the active heroine, now this isn't a heroine that you will find in all Gothic novels, and not even in all of Holt's novels, and not even universally in this particular heroine in Holt's novel. But this idea of heroines who are not simply reacting, but are engaged in sort of the active pursuit of their own ends and destinies, become active agents and investigants in these mysteries, in these Gothic romances, is found in Victoria Holt particularly, and this book, Menfreya. I don't recommend it, FYI. There is a really traumatic scene of coercive sexual control, and it's not condemned by the text, so boo. But I'm going to talk about Menfreya here because it's one of her most famous works, and it's also quite a good example of what I'm talking about in terms of female interrelation. So one of the things that's really interesting about Victoria Holt is that she's often talked about, of course, for her influence on the Gothic romance, but also as being a writer of fairly paradigmatic examples of the Gothic romance pertaining to that formula, which we've discussed before, that we saw today in relation to Anne Williams. But what is often erased by this particular focus on that particular idea of the narrative of Victoria Holt and the dark man in the house and the persecuted heroine is the way in which her texts often actually focus on an interconnected web of female relations. And this is one example among many in which the male hero is actually absent for most of the text, and in which often the most important relationships in the heroine's life are those with other female characters, and they don't fit simply into the categories offered by a lot of critique of Gothic romance of, oh, rival or double, for example. Harriet is the heroine of the story, and she becomes more passive after she gets married, but prior to that there is this idea of the power of her desire and her chasing the desire that she wants. She wants to be part of the Menfreya family. She wants that life. She wants to escape from her own loneliness and isolation. And we have various other female characters. We have her nurse Fanny, who is both the loving saviour and mother, and, spoiler alert, the one who's trying to murder her after a psychological break, and in which she starts seeing her dead husband and believes that the only way to keep Harriet safe from her husband, who she perceives as a villain, as do I, is by killing her and herself. So yeah, dark. But it's an exploration of obsessive love and, of course, of psychological breakdown, the effects of abuse and trauma, rather than simply being, oh, it's this love story with a little bit of a mystery in it. No, it's not. Gwen Menfrey is her wild best friend as younger, and it's that relationship which is much more important in the formation of her character. Jessica is sort of a rival within the text, but becomes a fight of her own happiness, somebody who's introduced into the house as a governess, a friend from the youth as well, always described as incredibly beautiful, and who is potentially attempting to steal Bevan, the hero, from Harriet. But we also see her portrayed as somebody who's fighting for her own happiness, disadvantaged by class and position, and is attempting to create a path for herself. And it's relatively sympathetically portrayed by the end of the novel. Jenny is the young and vivacious stepmother of Harriet, and although you might expect her to be the evil stepmother, there is a relationship of mutual support and sort of tolerance and even encouragement between them. Aunt Clarissa is the staid partisan of virtue, and Lisa is just beautiful because Bevan does have a wandering eye, because he is the worst. But as you can see here, we have this kind of mass of different female characters within the text, and, quoting myself here, a narrow focus on secondary female characters simply as doubles or rivals of the heroine ignores the way in which Gothics and Gothic romances more generally frequently explore a range of female interrelations and use them to investigate a range of female homosocial relations not mediated by a central male presence, depicting and exploring both the possibilities and dark corners of these relationships, as well as exploring varied and complex female subjectivities and a range of issues such as psychological disintegration, projection, obsessive maternal love, child loss, psychic doubling, and internal duality. So there's a lot more going on in these texts, and once we sort of recognize this focus on multiple different female characters, it's easier to see that. So also thinking about that progression of the Gothic romance and how it escapes from the formulaic idea of the heroine that we perhaps have, is looking at the way in which class and women interact within the Gothic. Again, moving away from these very kind of narrow understandings of a female Gothic or women in the Gothic, which concentrate which sort of universalize the white middle class female experience as the female experience. So the example that I'm giving you here is the Noble series by Christine Marion Fraser, which is the story of Anna and her terrible, terrible family, except her lovely brother Magnus, who isn't her brother, don't worry. So what are the Gothic credentials of this story? I feel like I shouldn't really have to give these credentials, but because the working women's romance is often ignored as part of the Gothic tradition, I will. There's madness, there's family secrets, there's confinement, there's abuse, there's threat, and the reality of sexual assault through transgressive relationships. Anna and Magnus are like in love. Tyrannical patriarchs and murder, and also a creative heroine in the Radcliffean style. But what we find in this depiction of the depiction of women and a working class heroine here, the main sort of dynamic of the text is not that you're able to avoid the threat formed by the social conditions of your world, but you simply have to survive it. So there's an emphasis on class realities and inequalities and present trauma rather than future threat, but also on different sort of conceptions of what it is to be or act out as a woman. So there's not a rejection to the same extent of, for example, domesticity, but the realities of having to run a house without any servants is a sort of a background to this novel, and a different form of entrapment in the domestic space, but also sort of a different exploration of those domestic spaces and how they're affected by different forms of kind of the male presence. It's also an investigation, for example, of alcoholism and its effect on families, different forms of mental health disintegration, etc. So another example, which gives a different way in which women are portrayed within this working class women's Gothic, and there are multiple different heroines, multiple different ways of portraying them, of course, is The Moth by Catherine Cookson. Recommend the ITV version, very nice, you can see it in the background. The Gothic credentials, again, you've got madness, family secrets, confinement, abuse, burning houses, transgressive relationships, this time between a lady and her odd job man, tyrannical patriarchs, and murder. So again, you have this sort of sense of not able to avoid, but rather to survive, partly because of the sort of the mingling of class identity that goes on. But it's also a novel which emphasizes class inequalities and the practicalities and problems of a relationship between people of different classes. And also the sort of inbuilt prejudices and misunderstandings which this particular female character has in regards to the working class hero. So there's this exploration of marrying down, which is a much more sort of relevant exploration of that interclass relationship than these sort of fantasies of marrying up that you often find within the sort of more middle class Gothic. So the last topic, which I'm going to very briefly look at, is this idea of fairy tales made Gothic. We looked at Jane Eyre as a sort of Cinderella narrative. You can also see it as a form of Bluebeard narrative, although of course the wife is alive in her attic. So fairy tales made Gothic, we would probably think first of all of The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter in terms of thinking about female rewritings of fairy tales as Gothic. But how do we understand these fairy tales and what they're doing? So because of sort of the popularity of Angela Carter, she does sort of dominate this debate in ways which emphasize only one particular way of looking at this rewriting. So Angela Carter suggests that what she does is pull out the latent content of fairy tales, which is sex and death. I think it's an interesting perspective. It's one that I think is a fairly a rigid or sort of confining conception of fairy tales, what they are, what they can be. And we also find in a lot of these sort of Gothic fairy tales is not only a participation with the latent content of the text, but also a rejection of specific content, as we're going to see in the examples I give in a second. Angela Carter emphasizes the way that sex, lust, and desire underline these fairy tales and places desire at the center of her rewritings. We have sort of the desire that in The Bloody Chamber itself, for example, and this kind of tenuous exploration of passion. But we also, I think, see within these Gothic rewritings of fairy tales, not always an exploration of sexual desire, but a new way of understanding desire. So a movement away from a fairy tale model of desire, which concentrates on desire as lack, i.e. the attempt to sort of acquire something within the text, and a movement towards the idea of desire as productive, i.e. that desire within these texts, what is wanted is change. What is wanted is a new way of being rather than a specific object, as we'll see in a second. We also have this distinction in Angela Carter. We're often sort of exploring this idea, not of felling, but of feeling the siren call of the monstrosity. So there's various texts where the female protagonist becomes a monster, the Tiger's Bride, for example, a monster, or marries into sort of into that relationship, or enters into a relationship with the monstrous other. So there's this sort of exploration of what that monstrosity is and its appeal. But we also have in some of the rewritings an uncovering of monstrosity, and an uncovering and rejection of a different form of monstrosity, as we're going to see. Bear that in mind when I talk about the Seventh Bride. So what we find in these two examples of Gothic female retellings, or female adjacent retellings of fairy tales that focus on female characters, or female perspectives, are different ways of understanding, are different ways of changing these fairy tales. So in T.J. Kingfisher's The Seventh Bride, we have this emphasis. It's a Bluebeard narrative, or we have the young heroine Rue, who has a hedgehog familiar, so my favorite in a lot of all time, who, because of her low class status, is forced into a relationship of marriage with the sort of nefarious protagonist. What we find in this is not a rewriting of passion, not an exploration thereof of forbidden or transgressive passions, but rather sort of a rejection of her status and an interaction with the other brides themselves, who are mostly still alive, although things have been taken from them. I'm not going to spoiler it for you, but things have been taken from them. And what you find in this is a narrative of female cooperation to overcome that patriarchal oppression, rather than the sense of a single escape. So what I think you have underlined is the monstrosity, not only of the Bluebeard figure, but of that original narrative, which is a sort of relatively individualistic look at the escape from Bluebeard's castle, and the idea of the triumph of a single escape, rather than the deconstruction of the system which was perpetuating the abuse. In the Unspeakable anthology, you have this story of The White Door by Linda King Miller, which again is a Bluebeard narrative with the twist. And in this one, you find that the power of the text is changing hands. Therefore, the desires of the text are changing focus. And in it, you have Margaret, who goes to the castle, believes she might be sort of the Bluebeard victim. But it turns out, of course, that the Bluebeard figure is not the Duke at all, but rather Lucy, the undead bride, who is forcing him to bring victims to the castle. And in the end of the story, the power has completely changed hands to the female apparent victim, but actually not Lucy, who ends up engaging in a relationship with Margaret, and they end up killing the Duke themselves. So you have this narrative of the change of power, change of hands. So, branching out from Jane Eyre, I've given a couple of examples of text created by featuring and depicting women. There are a plethora of other examples from different schools and traditions, exemplified, as we can see below, from MM-focused texts by writers like K.J. Charles, to paranormal romance, to the rewritings of Anne Rice, to different varied interpretations of the vampire coming out of perhaps different cultures and perspectives. The women's weird as a whole sort of feature of its own. The women's ghost story is another one that you can mention. Women's interactions in horror, interactions of non-heterosexual texts, such as The Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, and also in those filmic representations below, directed by women, starring and featuring women as the main protagonists. You can see different motifs in which women are presenting themselves and presenting their stories in the Gothic, from the more to the less action-packed, and also crossing over and interacting with other genres apart from the romance. So yes, hopefully that's given you an idea of some of that diversity, and I'm sorry that I have almost inevitably gone over a little bit there. Sorry about that. I did see people disappearing, so I'm sorry if you had to disappear. But you can't hear me because you're not here anymore. Why am I talking to you, disappearing ones? So yeah. Ooh, free ebook or audio on Amazon if you have Kindle Unlimited. Nice. It's good. You'll love the hedgehog. It gave me joy. It's a very sassy hedgehog. It's always like, it's like lifting a metaphorical eyebrow. So do feel free to stay and ask any questions that you have. If you have to go, I completely understand. I'll just pop my Ko-fi link if you want to support me there at the bottom. And do remember, if you haven't been to the last couple of weeks, if you want to support me, it's better to support me sort of once a month than every week, because they take money from every payment that you give on PayPal, just so you know. If you can't do that, that's totally fine. If you don't want to, that's totally fine. But just sort of for people who are regularly supporting me. So if you would like to stay, please do. I'm going to turn off the recording once I've answered any particular questions that you have in the chat, any sort of starting questions. I'm going to turn it off so we can have more of a discussion or a debate or chat, however people want. Oh yeah, the man character marries and is chased out by the ghost of the murdered wives. I don't know which story that is, unfortunately. But yes, there's so many different rewritings of the Bluebeard narrative. And a lot of them are really interesting and do much more interesting things than explore sexuality and sexual desire. I think, for me, much more interesting to me anyway. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Yes, I can't offer a really considered opinion of that. I'm afraid I will have to read it first. I mean, I think, like, we've talked about the Tenant of Wildfell Hall just in sort of its outline, and the way in which, you know, with the Brontes, they're offering very different models in all three of them of different sort of interactions with the portrayal of masculinity and the portrayal of heroinism. And obviously in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, you do have a woman who's obviously made the claim for her own subjectivity and sort of position within the text. Yeah, the idea that the Bronte girls who were essentially trapped to write such independent heroines, I think it's the Moors. But I mean, I also think there's this sense in which, obviously, the entrapped do tend to write often narratives of freedom, you know? Yeah, that they become sort of a projection of desire. Yeah, so I'm just going to turn the recording off, and then we can have a chat as you prefer, and everyone can leave if they want to or stay as they want. I've left another hour or so.